She didn't preach a sermon, she didn't lead an army, she didn't call down fire from heaven or part a sea or prophesy over nations. She didn't have a title that made people stop when she walked into a room. She wasn't seated at the table where the important decisions were being made. She wasn't mentioned in dispatches sent between apostles. She wasn't celebrated in the great gatherings of the early church as a theologian or a miracle worker or a voice that shaped doctrine. She sewed clothes. That's what she did. She sat down with fabric and thread and needle, and she made garments for people who needed them. She looked around at the widows in her community, women who were among the most economically vulnerable people in the entire ancient world, women with no husband to provide income, no safety net, no social structure designed to catch them. And she decided that what she could do was clothe them. So she did, faithfully, consistently, with her own hands. And when she died, those women stood in a room holding up the clothes she had made and wept. And then a man walked in, knelt down beside her body, prayed, and she opened her eyes. Her name was Tabitha, called Dorcas in Greek. And her story, which takes up exactly 9 verses in the entire New Testament, contains more concentrated teaching about what genuine faith looks like in daily life than entire libraries of religious theory. This is not a story about someone who did extraordinary things in the conventional sense. It is a story about someone who did ordinary things with such extraordinary consistency, such radical generosity, such deep and rooted love that when she was gone, the community felt it like a wound. And when God moved to restore her, the entire city of Joppa was shaken. Let's go all the way back to the beginning, because to understand why Tabitha matters, you need to understand the world she lived in and the community she served. The story of Tabitha takes place in a city called Joppa. Joppa was a coastal city on the Mediterranean, a port city with a long history. It sat on the edge of the sea on the western side of the land of Israel, about 35 miles northwest of Jerusalem. It was a working city, a city of commerce, of fishing, of trade, coming in and going out with the tides. It was not Jerusalem with its temple and its theological debates. It was not one of the great Roman urban centers with their forums and their colonnades. It was a port, a place where real people did real work and faced real problems. And in Joppa, there was a community of disciples, people who had come to believe in Jesus of Nazareth, who had heard the message that had been spreading outward from Jerusalem like rings on water after a stone is dropped. The movement that had started in an upper room with a handful of terrified people had been growing, moving, crossing boundaries, reaching into communities that the original disciples might never have imagined. And it had reached Joppa. Among those disciples in Joppa was a woman whose Aramaic name was Tabitha. The writer Luke, who recorded this account in the book of Acts, takes the unusual step of giving us both her names, Tabitha in Aramaic and Dorcas in Greek, which itself tells us something. She was known in both languages. She existed in both worlds, the Jewish community and the broader Greek-speaking world. Her identity crossed cultural lines, but more than her names, Luke immediately tells us something else. He tells us what she was known for, not what she believed in theory, not what she professed, what she actually did. She was full of good works and acts of charity, which she carried out continually. Full of good works, not occasionally generous, not helpful when it was convenient, not charitable in the way that many people are charitable. When the opportunity presents itself and the cost is manageable and someone might notice, full, continually. This was not a side project for Tabitha. This was the shape of her life. And then she became ill. We are not told what the illness was. We are not told how long it lasted or how quickly it progressed. What we are told is the outcome. She died. In the city of Joppa, in a community that depended on her, in a season when the early church was still fragile and finding its feet, Tabitha died. The community did what communities do in grief. They washed her body. They laid her in an upper room. They gathered around the loss and tried to figure out what came next. But someone in that community had heard something. They had heard that Peter, one of the central figures of the early church, one of the men who had walked with Jesus himself, one of the apostles, was nearby. He was in Lydda, a city not far from Joppa, about 12 miles inland, and something moved in the community of Joppa that refused to simply accept what had happened. 2 men were sent to find Peter, and what they said to him is worth paying attention to. They didn't say, "Please come pay your respects." They didn't say, "Come help us mourn." They said, "Please come to us without delay." There was urgency in it. There was something underneath the request that was not merely grief, but something closer to expectation. Something that believed this was not necessarily the end of the story. Peter went with them. When he arrived at the house in Joppa, he was taken to the upper room where Tabitha's body lay. And what he found there was a gathering of widows, women who had already lost the primary provider in their lives. Women who were living at the economic margins of the ancient world in a social structure that offered them almost no protection or support. Women who were vulnerable in every practical sense. And they were standing in that room weeping. But they weren't just weeping. They were showing Peter something. They were holding up tunics and garments, clothing, the things that Tabitha had made with her own hands. They were showing him the physical evidence of her love, not her words about love, not her stated intentions to help, but the actual objects that her actual hands had actually produced for them. Here, look at this. She made this for me with her hands. There is something profoundly moving about that image. These women had nothing to offer in terms of argument for why Tabitha should be restored. They couldn't make a theological case. They couldn't cite her accomplishments in the abstract. All they had was what she had given them, cloth and thread, and the warmth of garments made by someone who cared whether they were cold. And they held it up and let it speak. Peter sent everyone out of the room. He knelt down, he prayed, and then he turned to the body and said, simply, "Tabitha, get up." She opened her eyes, she saw Peter, she sat up. He took her hand and helped her stand. Then he called the saints and the widows, and he presented her to them alive. And the account tells us that this became known throughout all of Joppa. Many people believed in the Lord because of it. 9 verses, 1 woman. A community of widows holding up garments, a prayer, a resurrection, and a city shaken into belief. Now let's slow down and look at what is actually happening in this story, because the surface is remarkable enough, but underneath the surface there is something even more extraordinary. The first thing to notice is how Luke introduces Tabitha in a book that is full of dramatic events, Pentecost, miraculous escapes from prison, visions, journeys across the Mediterranean, confrontations with governors and kings. Luke pauses to give us 9 verses about a woman in a port city who made clothes for widows. He doesn't apologize for that. He doesn't frame it as a lesser story or a quiet interlude between the important moments. He presents it with the same narrative weight as everything else in the book. That choice is itself a theological statement. The community of people who follow Jesus does not operate according to the world's hierarchy of significance. In the world's hierarchy, the people who make the headlines are the ones with power, platform, wealth, influence, strategic position. The woman in Joppa making tunics for widows does not appear on that list. She is invisible to the structures that define importance in the Roman Empire. She is invisible to the religious establishment in Jerusalem. She is, by every conventional measure, a nobody. And Luke writes her story down permanently for 2,000 years of readers to encounter, because in the economy of the kingdom that Jesus inaugurated, the definition of greatness is completely inverted. The one who serves is the one who is great. The one who gives without recognition is the one who is seen. The one who uses her hands to clothe the vulnerable is doing something that registers at a level that the systems of the world cannot measure and therefore cannot dismiss. Tabitha registered. The second thing to notice is the community that formed around her generosity. When Peter arrived, he found widows. Not just any group of mourners, but specifically widows, women who had been the recipients of Tabitha's care, women whose lives had been concretely affected by what she did, and they were the ones who showed Peter the evidence. They were the ones who made the case, not in words but in cloth, for why this woman's life had mattered. There is a principle embedded in that moment that is worth pulling out and looking at directly. The people who will most powerfully speak to what your life has meant are the people whose lives have been most concretely changed by what you actually did. Not by what you intended, not by what you planned to do someday, not by the vision you cast or the speeches you gave or the position you held, by what you actually did. The tangible, physical, real-world impact of your choices on real people living real lives. Those widows weren't holding up Tabitha's doctrine, they were holding up her work, and the work spoke loudly enough to move a man to his knees. The third thing to notice is the specific people Tabitha chose to serve. Widows in the ancient world were not a minor demographic. They were a significant portion of the population, and they were among the most consistently vulnerable. In a world where women's economic participation was severely restricted, where property rights were almost entirely male, where social standing was largely derived from family connection and marital status, widows were women who had been stripped of their primary source of all of those things. They were dependent on the goodwill of their extended families, on community charity, on whatever small means they could scrape together. The Old Testament is full of commands from God to care for widows. The prophets condemned Israel again and again for neglecting them. The law made specific provision for them. The consistent message across centuries of Scripture was that the treatment of widows was a direct indicator of the spiritual health of a community. A community that ignored its widows was a community that had lost its way. Tabitha served widows. She didn't just know the command. She didn't just affirm the principle. She sat down with fabric and needle and thread, and she clothed them. She looked at the most overlooked people in her social world, and she decided that they deserved warmth and dignity and care. And she provided it with her own hands. The fourth thing to notice is what Peter does when he arrives. He sends everyone out of the room. He knelt down. He prayed. There is no spectacle in this. There is no gathering of witnesses to observe the miracle. There is no dramatic incantation or elaborate ritual. There is just a man, alone in a room with a dead woman, on his knees, in prayer. And it is worth noting that what Peter does here mirrors what Jesus himself did on at least one recorded occasion. When he raised Jairus' daughter, he also put everyone out of the room before he acted. That parallel is not accidental. It suggests that Peter is not operating on his own authority or his own power. He is moving in the same pattern that his teacher modeled, the pattern of withdrawal from spectacle of prayer, of action that flows out of a private encounter with the God who has the authority to restore life. The miracle in Joppa is not Peter's miracle, it is God's miracle carried out through Peter in response to a community's grief and expectation. Peter is the instrument, not the source, and the instruction he gives when he turns to her is simple: no elaborate formula, no lengthy prayer over her body, just get up. There is something almost breathtaking in the simplicity of it, the same kind of simple, direct, authoritative word that Jesus spoke in Bethany when he called a man out of a tomb, the same kind of word that moved over the chaos at the beginning of everything and brought order into being. Get up, open your eyes, come back. And she did. The fifth thing to notice is the effect on the city. It became known throughout all of Joppa, and many believed in the Lord. The resurrection of Tabitha was not a private event. It was not a secret shared only among the disciples. It spread. Word moved through the city the way significant news always moves through tight-knit communities, rapidly, urgently, person to person. And the result was belief. People who had not yet believed in Jesus came to believe because of what happened to this woman, which means that even in death, and then in her return from death, Tabitha was still serving, still pointing beyond herself, still being the occasion through which something greater than anything she could manufacture on her own was being made visible. Her life of service created a community of people who loved her deeply enough to send for Peter. Their love created the occasion for prayer. The prayer created the occasion for a miracle. The miracle created the occasion for an entire city to encounter God. One woman making clothes for widows, and the ripple effect reached a whole city. Now, there is a question that this story quietly but insistently raises, and it is a question worth sitting with for a while. What would people hold up if they were standing in a room trying to make the case for what your life has meant? Not what would they say in theory, not the abstract descriptions of what kind of person you are, but what would they hold up? What is the physical, tangible evidence of your love? What have your hands actually made, built, repaired, given, offered? Who has been fed, clothed, comforted, sheltered, or dignified because of specific things you did on specific days? Tabitha's legacy was held in the hands of the people she served. It was visible, it was warm, it was wearable, it was real. And that is a profoundly challenging standard, because most of us spend an enormous amount of energy on things that will not be held up in that room. Positions we accumulate, impressions we manage, platforms we build, reputations we curate. None of those things get held up the way those widows held up their garments. What gets held up is the thing you made for someone who needed it, the meal you cooked, the bill you paid, the time you sat with someone when sitting with them cost you something, the letter you wrote, the need you noticed and met without waiting to see if anyone was watching. Tabitha didn't appear to be waiting to see if anyone was watching. The account describes her good works and acts of charity as things she did continually, not occasionally, not when circumstances aligned perfectly, continually. It was the rhythm of her life. That word, continually, is doing a lot of work in those 9 verses. It tells us that Tabitha's generosity was not an event. It was a practice. It was something she had built into the structure of her daily life to the point where it was simply what she did. She didn't have to make a fresh decision each time an opportunity presented itself. The decision had already been made at a deeper level. Serving was what she was, so serving was what she did. That kind of consistency is actually quite rare. It is much easier to be generous in moments of inspiration than to be generous as a way of life. It is much easier to respond to dramatic need when it presents itself visibly than to quietly, persistently, unglamorously meet need in the ordinary rhythms of daily existence. Tabitha had figured out how to be the second kind of person, and that is why her loss created a wound in the community that sent two men running to find Peter. Let's talk for a moment about what it means that Tabitha was brought back. The resurrection of Tabitha is one of only a handful of resurrection accounts in the entire New Testament outside of Jesus himself. In the recorded history of the early church, this is an extraordinary event. It doesn't happen constantly. It doesn't happen to everyone who dies. It happened here, to this woman, in this community. Why? We are not told explicitly. The text doesn't give us a theological explanation for why Tabitha was raised and others were not. It doesn't tell us that she was brought back because she was more deserving than other disciples who died. It doesn't frame it as a reward for her good works. The miracle is presented as an act of God's grace, not something earned or calculated. But there is something worth noticing in the community's response. They sent for Peter. They acted on expectation. They refused to treat her death as the final word before they had at least brought it before someone who walked in the power of the risen Jesus. And in that act of community expectation, in that urgent sending of two men to Lydda with the message, "Please come without delay," there was faith operating, not certainty, not the knowledge of what Peter would be able to do, but a refusal to simply give up, a determination to bring the situation before the one who might have access to something beyond the situation's apparent finality. And when Peter came and knelt and prayed and she opened her eyes, the faith was answered, not because the community deserved a miracle, but because the God who can restore life chose, in this moment and this place and for this community, to make visible what he is always able to do. Tabitha is also one of the few women in the New Testament who is explicitly called a disciple. The word used in the Greek text is the feminine form of the word for disciple, methetria, and it appears nowhere else in the entire New Testament. This is the only place in the biblical record where a woman is directly and individually referred to using that specific term. That is worth stopping on. In a world where women's religious participation was circumscribed by cultural expectations and social norms, where the formal roles of teaching and leading were occupied almost exclusively by men, where women who believed were largely invisible to the historical record, Luke calls Tabitha a disciple, individually, by name, using the precise term for someone who is a learner, a follower, a committed student and practitioner of the way of Jesus. And the evidence of her discipleship that Luke points to is not theological knowledge or leadership role or public proclamation. It is good works and acts of charity carried out continually. Her discipleship looked like needles and thread and garments given to women who had nothing. Her following of Jesus looked like showing up for the people the world had largely forgotten and giving them the warmest, most practical form of dignity she could offer. That is what a disciple looked like in Joppa. That is what faithfulness looked like in the hands of this particular woman in this particular place. And the implication for anyone reading this story, regardless of what century they inhabit, is both clear and convicting. Discipleship is not primarily a set of beliefs to affirm. It is a way of living that shows up in the physical world, in the real lives of real people, through the work of real hands. Tabitha believed, and because she believed, she sewed clothes for widows. The believing and the sewing were not two separate things. They were one thing expressed in two registers, one internal and one external. The faith was the root, the works were the fruit, and you could tell what the root was by looking at the fruit. Let's talk about the widows one more time, because I think they deserve more attention than they usually get in readings of this story. These women were not incidental to the narrative. They are not background characters. They are present, named by category, standing in the room, active participants in what happens. They are the ones who meet Peter at the door. They are the ones who escort him to the upper room. They are the ones who present the evidence. They are, in a real sense, the ones who make the case for Tabitha's life. And in doing so, they reveal something crucial about the nature of Tabitha's giving. Her giving was relational, not transactional. She didn't drop clothes at a donation point and move on. She made clothes for specific people. She knew these women. She served these women specifically, individually, personally. And they knew her. They grieved her with the particular grief that comes not from losing a benefactor, but from losing a friend. Someone who had seen them and known them and given to them from a place of genuine care. That is the difference between charity as a mechanism and love as a practice. Charity as a mechanism can function without relationship. You can give money to causes without knowing any of the people affected. You can donate goods without any personal encounter. That kind of giving is not without value, but it is not what Tabitha did. Tabitha did the harder thing. She built relationship. She was present. She knew the women she served well enough that they knew exactly which garments she had made, well enough that they could hold specific items up and say, "She made this. For me. This one." That kind of giving requires time, it requires presence, it requires vulnerability, the willingness to enter someone else's poverty and grief and difficulty and stay long enough to actually know it. That is more costly than writing a check, and it is more transforming both for the giver and for the recipient. The widows in that room were not simply recipients of charity, they were known. And being known is one of the most powerful gifts one human being can give to another. There is one more thing about this story that I don't want to leave unaddressed. It has to do with the aftermath. After Peter presented Tabitha alive to the saints and the widows, the account tells us that Peter stayed in Joppa for many days in the house of a man named Simon, a tanner. And it is during that extended stay in Joppa, made possible because of what happened with Tabitha, that Peter receives the vision that begins to open the door for the gospel to move to the Gentiles. The vision of the sheet full of animals, the voice saying, "What God has called clean, you must not call unclean." The arrival of messengers from a Roman centurion named Cornelius. The story of Tabitha is the reason Peter was in Joppa, and being in Joppa was the occasion for one of the most significant turning points in the entire history of the early church, the moment when the movement of Jesus began its formal expansion beyond the boundaries of the Jewish world into the wider Gentile world. One woman's resurrection, 9 verses, and the ripples reach further than anyone in that room could have imagined. That is what faithfulness produces, not just the direct, visible fruit of the work you do, but effects that extend outward in directions you cannot see, through chains of causation you could never have planned, into futures you will never personally witness. Tabitha served widows. Her death brought Peter to Joppa. Peter's presence in Joppa positioned him to receive a world-altering vision. The world-altering vision opened the door for the message of Jesus to reach the entire Gentile world. The woman with the needle and thread was part of the chain that led to the gospel crossing one of its most significant boundaries. She had no idea, and she didn't need to. She just needed to do the next right thing for the next person in front of her. With the resources she had in the place she was, she needed to keep sowing. The question this story leaves us with is not complicated. It doesn't require advanced theological training to understand. It doesn't require access to resources most people don't have. It doesn't require a platform or a position or a title. The question is simply this: who is in front of you right now? Who is overlooked in your immediate world? Not in the abstract, not somewhere across the globe where it's easy to feel compassion from a distance, but right here, in your community, on your street, in your congregation, in your city. Who is the widow in your world? Who is the person whose need is visible and whose dignity is at risk, and whose life would be concretely better if someone with hands and time and care simply showed up and did something? Tabitha found her answer. She found it in the widows of Joppa, and she gave them not just goods but presents, not just charity but relationship, not just a garment but the dignity of being known. That is what genuine faith looks like when it gets out of the building and into the street, when it stops being something you believe privately and starts being something you do publicly. When it takes the shape of whatever your hands are best suited to make and puts that making in the service of the people most in need of it. Tabitha sowed. You might build, or cook, or teach, or listen, or visit, or drive, or organize, or fund, or repair, or simply sit with someone in the dark and refuse to leave until the morning comes. Whatever form your faithfulness takes, take it consistently, without waiting for recognition, without calibrating your generosity based on who's watching. In the rhythm of daily life, in the small decisions that accumulate into a life that will one day be testified to by the people whose lives you touched. Because the God who noticed a woman with a needle in Joppa is the same God who is watching what you do with what you have in the place where you are right now. He doesn't miss it, he doesn't forget it, and he is still the God who can take a life fully given in service to others, even a life that death appears to have ended, and bring it back, restore it, cause it to open its eyes and sit up and stand. Tabitha got up, and the city believed, and your faithfulness, quiet, consistent, hand to hand and face to face, has more power to move the world than you will ever be able to measure. Keep sowing. Because the God who sees what is done in secret, who honors what is given without recognition, who notices the garments made for women the world has forgotten, that God is not done writing your story either. And the city you are in is watching, even when you think no one is.